And after the wedding, when the last yacht had drifted away from Venice and the headlines should have faded, Lauren Sanchez did not step quietly into the shadows. Instead, she seemed to grow louder, brighter, more unmissable than before her image appeared. On every glossy magazine cover, her social calendar looked like a never-ending carousel of galas, premieres, and private dinners. Her outfits, each one dissected in microscopic detail by fashion critics and fans alike, while every whisper of her next move became instant news. And this constant glare of attention was not just about her being Jeff Bezos' wife. It was about her ability to play into the fascination and almost bend it to her will. She smiled, she posed, she leaned into the extravagance, while her detractors muttered about vanity and opportunism. And yet, even in that noise, there was something magnetic, something that made people keep watching, as though Lauren herself had become a performance piece. A living question mark about power, privilege, and femininity, and the more she embraced that role, the more she blurred the line between being an object of gossip and being the one directing the gossip, which is why the world continues to ask where she will go next, what boundary she will cross, what spectacle she will stage. Because in Lauren Sanchez's story, the ending never feels final. It always feels like just another beginning. And that was exactly the point, because Lauren knew instinctively that in a media landscape where attention is the rarest currency she had to keep the cameras rolling, the clicks flowing, the whispers circulating, she had to turn her life into an ongoing serial one that people could not stop watching. And to do that, she had to make every appearance, every outfit, every gesture carry the weight of a headline. She had to transform what would be ordinary choices for most into cultural flashpoints that people argued over, admired, mocked, and secretly envied. Because what the critics often forgot was that fascination is not built out of thin air. It is carefully maintained. It is cultivated like a garden that must always be in bloom. And Lauren had learned through her years in front of cameras how to water that garden, how to prune it, how to keep it irresistible, and she used that knowledge to propel herself into a stratosphere where few women could exist with ease. A stratosphere of helicopters and couture fittings, of whispered invitations to the world's most exclusive parties, of knowing that she could command the gaze of the global press with a single dress or a single remark. And what fascinated the public even more was the question of agency. Was Lauren merely a passenger on the rocket ship of Bezos' wealth, or was she, in her own way, steering the course? Because if she were just a passenger, the story might not be so enduring. But if she were quietly a co-pilot shaping the spectacle, then suddenly the intrigue doubled. And perhaps this was why every new photograph of her seemed less like a candid and more like a carefully staged tableau, a living artwork of luxury, power, and audacity. And as the months after the wedding unspooled, the fascination did not cool. In fact, it seemed to intensify, because the world was no longer just looking at Lauren Sanchez as a glamorous new wife. They were looking at her as a symbol of something larger, as a reflection of how celebrity wealth and influence collide in the 21st century. She was photographed stepping onto private jets as though they were taxis. She was filmed descending from helicopters in outfits that looked pulled straight from fashion runways. She was spotted at glittering parties with politicians, tech moguls, and movie stars. And each time she appeared, it was as if the lens magnified her presence, turning a single evening out into a global talking point. What perfume she wore, what jewels she carried, what expressions flickered across her face. Everything became subject to commentary. And the irony of it all was that Lauren herself seemed to understand this game better than anyone else. She had once been a journalist. She had worked the entertainment beat. She had studied how celebrities moved, how they guarded their image, how they slipped up and fell. She knew the anatomy of fame from the inside. And so when she found herself at the center, she played the part with the precision of a director who knows exactly where the cameras are placed. But unlike the stars she once covered, she had something they never did. She had Jeff Bezos and his vast fortune, and the combination of her media savvy with his limitless resources created a spectacle unlike anything tabloids had handled before. And people argued endlessly about whether she was manipulating him or whether he was elevating her. But in truth, it was the symbiosis that mattered, because together, They were feeding a narrative that no one could look away from. And as the pictures circulated, the world began to realize that Lauren was not just arm candy, she was a lightning rod. She was the figure through which fantasies about wealth, power, beauty, and resentment all collided. She was the woman who sparked admiration, envy, scorn, and curiosity in equal measure. And perhaps that was why even her detractors could not ignore her. Because to mock her was still to give her oxygen to speak her name, was still to feed her myth. And Lauren seemed to understand that too, because she never flinched under the criticism. She leaned into it. She let it swirl around her like wind in the sails of her ship, pushing her further into the glare of attention, because she knew that relevance is not about pleasing everyone. It is about ensuring that no one can stop talking about you. And so the cycle went on. The yacht trips, the designer gowns, the diamond necklaces, the whispered rumors of business projects or charity endeavors, or secret plans, and each rumor kept the fascination alive because speculation is the lifeblood of fame. And Lauren gave the world just enough to speculate without ever surrendering the full truth. And that balance was what made her so unmissable. She was not simply a wife. She was a question mark dressed in couture, and the more people asked that question, the longer her story stretched. And as the spotlight grew hotter, Lauren Sanchez did not retreat. Instead, she expanded her presence into arenas where critics least expected her. She began to appear in conversations not only about fashion and society, but about aviation philanthropy, even space travel. And it was here that her story took on an almost cinematic arc, because unlike many who married into great fortunes, Lauren had her own passions, her own skills, her own pursuits. She was a licensed pilot. She had logged countless hours in the sky. She spoke with confidence about flight and adventure, and when she was photographed near helicopters or jets, it did not feel like a borrowed accessory. It felt like a second skin, and that was part of the intrigue, because the public could never quite pin her down. Was she a socialite clinging to luxury, or an adventurer in her own right, carving out new paths? And that ambiguity kept people riveted because it allowed every person to project their own narrative onto her. Some saw her as a gold digger, others as a pioneer. Some dismissed her as a symbol of excess. Others quietly admired her audacity to live without apology. And this duality was the fuel of her myth. And as the months wore on, the press began to document not just her gowns and jewels, but her philanthropic outings, her foundation work, her comments about women in aviation, her appearances at events where she spoke less as Bezos' wife and more as an advocate for her own causes. And yet even in those moments, the luxury remained close by, because Lauren never separated the two worlds she inhabited. She fused them together, the high glamour with the earnest activism, the couture gowns with the heartfelt speeches, and this fusion itself became a performance art, one that blurred the line between sincerity and spectacle. But perhaps that was the secret of her endurance, because sincerity without spectacle is ignored, and spectacle without sincerity is empty. And somehow she found the knife edge between them, balancing so precisely that she drew both adoration and outrage. And in a media ecosystem where both are currencies, she was growing richer by the day, not in dollars alone, but in relevance. And this relevance meant that every headline, every photo, every whisper became another stitch in the fabric of her story. And the story itself was becoming larger than her. It was becoming a mirror for society's obsessions, its envies, its contradictions. Because when people looked at Lauren, they saw not only a woman draped in diamonds, they saw the fantasy of wealth they could never reach. They saw the possibility of reinvention. They saw the spectacle of glamour colliding with grit, and they argued about her. Because to argue was to wrestle with their own desires and frustrations. And Lauren, in her poised silence, let them argue, let them project, let them feed the machine of her myth. And as she walked red carpets and climbed into helicopters, she became less a person and more a symbol, one that no one could fully understand, but no one could ignore. And that was her greatest power. And as her legend swelled, Lauren Sanchez became a study in contrasts. Because while she basked in a level of luxury that seemed almost untouchable, she simultaneously cultivated a relatability that unsettled her critics. She laughed loudly in interviews. She spoke openly about her insecurities. She shared snippets of family life on social media that reminded people she was not born into palaces and yachts. She had hustled in newsrooms, she had auditioned. She had been rejected, she had worked long, days chasing stories for local stations. And this duality gave her myth a foundation, because no matter how extravagant her current reality became, it was anchored by a backstory of struggle and ambition, and audiences clung to that because it complicated the caricature of the opportunist trophy wife, and it made her harder to dismiss in the soundbite culture of celebrity gossip. Her past became a shield, and she wielded it deftly because she knew that every icon is sustained not by their present, but by the narrative of how far they have traveled. And hers was the journey from studio lights to starlit yachts, from reporting on celebrities to becoming the most dissected celebrity of them all. And this inversion fascinated the public because it blurred the line between observer and subject and gave her an aura of inevitability, as though she had always been destined for this stage. And that sense of destiny made her appearances feel weighted with symbolism, as if every dress, every gesture, every glance was not only fashion, but fate unfolding, and when she and Bezos stepped into public together, the effect doubled. He was the world's wealthiest man. She was the woman who had captivated him, and together they became a cultural Rorschach, test inspiring admiration, envy, ridicule, and endless analysis. And in that pairing, Lauren often absorbed more of the fascination than Jeff himself, because people expected him to be a billionaire, but they could not quite compute her transformation. From anchor desk to global spectacle. And so she became the question mark, the enigma, the lightning rod, the subject of debates that spilled across talk shows and podcasts and digital columns. And the fascinating part was that Lauren did not appear to resist. She embraced the role she fed the discourse with every new outing, with every candid staged, or not with every whisper of what she might do next. And the world learned quickly that the more they speculated, the more she thrived, because speculation was not a threat to her. It was oxygen, it was fuel, and she inhaled it effortlessly until she became something larger than a headline. She became a phenomenon. And as the phenomenon grew, Lauren Sanchez began to embody a new archetype, the woman who refuses to be boxed in, because for decades, society had loved to define women by their partners, by their wardrobes, by their spending habits. But Lauren twisted those definitions into spectacle. She let herself be defined, and then she shattered. The definition she wore diamonds the size of strawberries and then appeared barefoot. In candid shots, she stepped off yachts in couture and then posted family photos with messy hair. She played into the role of the glamorous wife while also stepping into helicopters as a pilot, and this constant shape-shifting made her impossible to categorize. And that impossibility was what kept people watching. Because humans crave categories, they crave neat boxes. And when someone refuses the box, they become infinitely more fascinating. And Lauren seemed to understand this. At an instinctive level, she kept her narrative fluid, ever evolving, never stagnant. And because of that, the fascination only deepened. And when the headlines began to suggest that her marriage was not simply a fairy tale, but a strategic partnership, a merging of influence and ambition, Lauren did not deny it. She let the speculation swirl because she knew that silence was louder than denial, and each rumor became another thread in her tapestry of mystery. And as critics accused her of opportunism, admirers reframed her as a woman rewriting the rules of power dynamics. And in that tension, she thrived because she had become not just a celebrity, not just a socialite, but a cultural debate, a mirror that forced people to wrestle with their ideas of wealth, gender ambition, and visibility. And every time her name trended, every time her photos ricocheted across screens, she cemented her status further until she was not merely famous, she was necessary to the discourse itself, a figure without whom the conversation about modern celebrity felt incomplete. And this was her truest triumph, because fame that relies only on beauty or wealth fades quickly, but fame that taps into deeper anxieties and desires becomes enduring. And Lauren Sanchez had done exactly that. She had transformed from news anchor to billionaire's wife, to living symbol of everything people love and hate about wealth and spectacle in our time. And in that transformation, she became more than the woman who wore the ring, more than the woman who danced at the Venetian wedding. She became the woman the world could not stop watching, the story that refused to end, the headline that kept writing itself. And in that endless unfolding, her power was not just to dazzle, but to endure. Because as long as people argued about her, they could never erase her. And as long as she kept offering them new reasons to argue, she would never fade. She would remain incandescent, unmissable, unstoppable. The kind of figure who ensures that every ending is only the beginning of the next chapter. And in that relentless cycle, Lauren Sanchez secured something greater than diamonds or gowns. She secured permanence in the ever-shifting theater of fame. Hypergamy, or the act of marrying up into a higher socioeconomic class, is not a fresh idea. It is as old as monarchy, as dynasties, as the fairy tales where a peasant girl becomes queen. But in 2025, the idea has surged back into the cultural bloodstream, not whispered behind closed doors, but flaunted openly in podcasts, hashtags, viral videos, and even in the branding of jewelry lines. And at the center of this renewed obsession stands Lauren Sanchez, the woman who has become shorthand for marrying into extreme wealth. The woman who turned her relationship with Jeff Bezos into a spectacle of rings, yachts, gowns, and tabloid fever. And whether she intended it or not, her name now circulates in the same conversations as Melania Trump, Jordan Hudson, and Huma Abedin, women who in different ways have attached themselves to men of greater wealth and power, and who have forced society to ask difficult questions about agency, ambition, and desire. In an era where the economy feels more precarious than ever, the manosphere bristles at this archetype, and voices like Andrew Tate call women manipulators, gold diggers, strategists of seduction, while countless young men online perform loyalty tests and speak of financial traps. Yet beneath the noise lies a kernel of truth. Because for many straight women, hypergamy is not a cynical ploy, but an earnest desire, the yearning for stability, for elevation, for security in a world where wages stagnate and costs spiral. And so the conversation has become louder, more unapologetic. Younger women on TikTok post wish lists for men in finance, men with trust funds, men 6'5" with blue eyes, some of it satirical, some of it deadly serious, and songs emerge from memes turning the hunt for a wealthy partner into pop culture anthems at the same time. Services like Seeking.com openly market themselves on the principle of hypergamy, connecting sugar daddies with sugar babies, while platforms like OnlyFans capitalize on men willing to pay for proximity to women's attention. And what emerges from this stew is not only a generational shift, but a cultural reckoning. And in that reckoning, Lauren Sanchez has become more than a woman. She has become a symbol. She embodies the spectacle of what it looks like to step into extreme hypergamy and not hide it, to flaunt it on red carpets and magazine covers, to live it so fully that it transforms from a personal choice into a cultural mirror, reflecting the anxieties, the fantasies, and the contradictions of our time. Hypergamy, or the act of marrying up into a higher socioeconomic class, is not a fresh idea. It is a story as old as history itself. But in our modern era, it has returned not in whispers, not in discreet marriages arranged for family advantage, but on full display broadcast, on podcasts, memes, viral TikToks, and most vividly through the lives of women like Lauren Sanchez. And what makes her case so magnetic is that she embodies this phenomenon in its most extreme form. She did not just marry. Rich, she married into the orbit of the second wealthiest man on earth, and in doing so, she ignited fascination, envy, criticism, and applause. In equal measure, because the idea of hypergamy is no longer hidden. It is a conversation piece. It is a strategy. It is a choice that younger generations are increasingly unafraid to name out loud. The manosphere rails against it, calling women manipulators, accusing them of siphoning resources and loyalty from unsuspecting men, figures like Andrew Tate Thunder. Online about gold diggers, while countless young men devise tests to catch women seeking financial gain. But the louder the complaints grow, the more visible the trend becomes, because behind the cynicism lies an undeniable reality: economic precarity. has shifted the romantic landscape. Wages remain stagnant, housing costs balloon, student debt crushes opportunities. And for many young women, the notion of building an independent empire feels more exhausting than aspirational. So the fantasy of marrying into wealth begins to look less like a fairy tale and more like financial logic, a pragmatic choice in chaotic times. And when Lauren appeared with her 30-carat ring, when she floated across Venice in gowns that cost as much as houses, when she embodied the spectacle of luxury, she became not just a bride, but a symbol of a generational negotiation about what marriage means today. She became the embodiment of an unapologetic embrace of hypergamy, and the culture could not look away. Her story was not an isolated love affair. It was a mirror reflecting thousands of conversations happening in bedrooms, dorm rooms, podcasts, and social feeds around the world, where young women joked about finding a man in finance trust fund, 6'5" blue eyes, but where beneath the humor lay real longing, real exhaustion with the grind culture that promised empowerment, yet delivered burnout. And this longing has been monetized by platforms like Seeking Calm, which openly markets hypergamy as its founding principle, connecting sugar daddies with sugar babies, while OnlyFans thrives on men willing to pay for women's attention, blurring the lines between economic transaction and intimacy. And in that ecosystem, Lauren Sanchez appears, less like an outlier and more like the apex of a visible pyramid. She sits at the top, dazzling in couture, while millions of women watch from the base, calculating their own strategies, and millions of men seethe, debate, or fantasize. And this duality explains why her every move draws attention, because she has transcended personal narrative. She has become archetype, and archetypes are powerful. They shape discourse, they spark obsession, they anchor the collective imagination. Lauren's notoriety then is not only about her gowns or her ring. It is about what she represents to both sides of the cultural divide. To women, she represents possibility, reinvention, the chance to marry into security and luxury without apology. To men, she represents fear, resentment, desire, the suspicion that women are strategizing behind every smile. And so she is both admired and resented, both ridiculed and revered. And it is this tension that ensures her permanence, because figures who polarize do not fade. They endure in every podcast rant, every viral meme, every tabloid cover. She is reinforced as the face of modern hypergamy, and she does not run from it. She leans into it. She attends galas, she gives interviews, she wears the gowns and jewels that prove the archetype alive and real. And because she has lived a public life before, as a journalist, as a television host, she understands the mechanics of visibility. She knows that to retreat is to lose the narrative, so she does not retreat. She expands. She gives her audience more spectacle, more provocation, more reason to debate. And in doing so, she transforms criticism into fuel. Like a pilot catching a headwind, she uses the resistance to climb higher. And what fascinates the culture further is that beneath the diamonds and yachts, there is still her own ambition. She is a pilot, she is an entrepreneur, she is a woman who carved out a career before this marriage. And that complicates the story because it denies critics the comfort of dismissing her as only a passenger on Bezos' rocket. Instead, she becomes the co-pilot and perhaps even the one navigating perception. And so hypergamy, as embodied by Lauren Sanchez, is not a passive tale. It is an active strategy, a story of a woman who knew how to merge her image with the wealth of her partner, and in doing so, elevate both of them into a spectacle the world cannot ignore. And this spectacle, in turn, shapes the culture as young women reference her in their own fantasies. And young men warn each other against becoming Jeff Bezos in miniature. The conversation loops endlessly. And in that loop, Lauren remains central, unavoidable, inevitable, because she is no longer just herself. She is a metaphor for what it means to love and marry in an age where money and media are intertwined inseparably. And in this way, her story is not an ending, but a beginning. Not a settled fate, but an ongoing negotiation between power, beauty, ambition, and wealth. And as long as the questions remain unresolved, as long as young women post wish lists for wealthy lovers, as long as young men rage against gold diggers, as long as podcasts and tabloids hunger for symbols, Lauren Sanchez will remain on the stage, unmissable, unstoppable, incandescent, a living emblem of hypergamy in the 21st century.